so excited to bring you this conversation with Sahil Bloom, who is a New York Times bestselling author, entrepreneur, and investor. He wrote the best-selling book, Five Types of Wealth, a transformative guide to design your dream life, and is also an inspirational writer, content creator, and shares his ideas with millions of people every week through his biweekly newsletter, The Curiosity Chronicle. And I really enjoyed this conversation as a reminder for how to prioritize different types of wealth in your life, but also to really pour into the relationships that matter most. So enjoy and happy listening. Hi, Sahil. Thank you so much for spending time with me today and spending time with the You Love and You Learn community.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to be here. I just finished reading your book and I feel like everyone should go read it, but I want them to get a little preview of what to expect in the book. So, congratulations on all the success of the book.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I agree. A good preview never hurt anybody.
For sure. I'm super curious. Did you have this idea all along, or was there a certain moment where you kind of pulled the pieces together for this book, or was it brought to you? Like, how did this all come to be?
I often say that you shouldn't write a book just because you think it's time to write a book. Like, you really need to you need to almost feel like this book needs to exist in the world. And I had been writing and sharing things for a little while and had been approached by people of like, oh, you should write a book. That's kind of the next thing. You write a newsletter, you have Twitter newsletter, like the next thing is book. And I didn't have something that was pulling me in that way until it kind of hit me over the head with this aha moment. And the aha moment was my own life, frankly, through a unfortunate, I suppose, set of circumstances that I spent the first 7 years of my career marching down this very traditional path to what we think of as a successful life. I was doing the things you're supposed to want to do. I took the job that sounded good on LinkedIn rather than the job that I maybe wanted to do. And I basically marched forward during those 7 years with this deeply ingrained conviction that my own internal security, satisfaction, contentment, happiness with who I was on the other side of some achievement. I call it the gold medal fallacy, this idea that you're going to get the gold medal and you're going to feel different about who you are. There's this quote from this movie, Cool Runnings, where the coach says to one of the athletes, a gold medal is a wonderful thing, but if you're not enough without it, you're never going to be enough with it. And I had to learn that on my own journey, and it took me 7 years to figure it out. I'd go get those gold medals and then feel that sort of momentary blip of happiness and then reset to this familiar, really dread of not doing enough, needing to do more. And unfortunately, on that journey for me, while I was winning in this one domain of sort of traditional definitions of success, job titles, money, etc., I was starting to see the other areas of my life fall apart. Most importantly, my relationships. I was living 3,000 miles away from my parents who were getting older. I wasn't seeing them basically at all. My relationship with my sister had effectively ground to a halt. And my wife and I, unfortunately, were struggling to conceive at the time. We were in the middle of this 2 year struggle with infertility that was causing strain in our relationship for the first time. And, I was drinking 6, 7 nights a week, which was compounding all of that mental and physical health in disarray. And all at a time where, on the surface, from the outside looking in, if you had seen me, you would have said, I'm winning the game, right? I'm doing the things you're supposed to want to do. I'm achieving the things you're supposed to want to achieve. And at the end of 2020, I started to have this sensation that if that was what winning felt like, I had to be playing the wrong game.
Mm.
And on that journey, that's a very tough realization to be able to look in the mirror and say that to yourself, especially as someone who sort of self-identifies as an achiever, right? Like I'm doing things and I'm doing the things I'm supposed to want to do and the things that I've had so much conviction around, and resetting all of that sort of feels like ripping down your identity. And so all of that for me came to a head with a single conversation when an old friend asked how I was doing. And I admitted that it was hard living so far away from my parents. And he asked, how old are they? And I said mid 60s. And he asked how often I saw them. And I said about once a year. And he just looked at me and said, okay, so you're going to see your parents 15 more times before they die. And that was the moment that brought everything crashing down, metaphorically and literally. because in that moment, I realized that my entire definition of success, of what it meant to go and build a wealthy life, had been incomplete. I was focusing on this one thing at the expense of everything else. And that was the spark that I needed to go and create a change, to go and rip down that identity and go rebuild a new one. And that was the spark that ultimately led to me sharing these ideas with the world, like sort of redefining what it means to live a wealthy life.
Yeah, I remember that beginning piece that you shared at the start of the book that basically said that was kind of the moment that sparked it. And then through the last, I guess, 5 years from that process, did you realize in your own life personally that there were these other categories of wealth that were more important? Or how did you end up understanding those four other categories aside from financial wealth? And for someone maybe who hasn't read the book, to introduce the rest of the conversation, maybe you can just share what those other four categories are.
Yeah, so after that conversation, I really went on a journey to try to understand why I had fallen victim to this sort of trap in the first place. And if money was sort of an incomplete way to think about building a good life, what were the other pillars? You kind of know that subconsciously, that there's these other things in life that clearly really matter. And the problem with that sort of subconscious or like back of mind awareness is that back of mind awareness, it's very easy to say, I know that. Someone says something to you and you're like, oh, I know that. Of course, you brush it off. But if you don't have awareness at the testing point, like when you are actually tested, when you need to go take an action, if you don't have the awareness right there, you won't act on that awareness. And awareness without action is completely useless. So I might have said to you prior to making this big change in my life that family really mattered to me. Number
Mm.
one priority is my family, my people. But I wasn't acting on that awareness. So it's not enough to say, like, oh, yeah, that's my priority. Because if someone were to come and watch me for a week, they wouldn't have said that that was my priority. My actions were not bearing out the priority that I would have said I had. And so I wanted to really understand why that was happening and what were the contributors. Like, what were these things? If I could really lay out a new scoreboard, a new way to measure life, what would be on that scoreboard? And the way that I went about that was both internal in my own life, thinking on it, musing on it, praying on it, and then external, which was I ended up having conversations with thousands of people over the course of 2+ years researching for the book. People from all walks of life, young and old, people scraping by on through like multi billionaires, kings and queens of the world, everything from a man who had just been paroled from a 25-year prison sentence through a barber who had grown up homeless, like all manner of people. And I asked young people what their ideal life looked like in the future. What were they trying to build towards? I asked old people what advice they would give to their younger self, what regrets they have, what they would have done differently. And what I kept hearing over and over and over again were these four themes. And the four things were time, people, purpose, and health. Time, people, purpose, and health. Money is an enabler to those, but it was not an end in and of itself. Very few, almost no one talked about this extraordinary amount of money that they wanted to have or that they regretted not focusing more on that. It was always about those four things. And so that was what zooming out helped craft this idea of these five types of wealth. If financial wealth is one, the other four are time wealth, which is all about freedom to choose how you spend your time. It's about an awareness of time as your most precious asset. Social wealth is all about your relationships. Mental wealth is about purpose and growth and creating the space necessary to wrestle with some of these bigger picture questions in life. And then physical wealth, which is about your health and vitality. And so those four combined with financial wealth form this idea of the five types of wealth, a new scoreboard to measure your life with the hypothesis that when you measure the right things, you take the right actions and you create the desired outcomes.
Yeah. And as I was reading it, I felt like the thing you just said earlier about knowing a lot about those topics, or yeah, I know that. I still learned so much about how to optimize those topics, even as someone who does consider myself an achiever or someone who explores these categories just as a personal interest. So I think it's important that you mentioned that knowing the information isn't enough, then you actually have to do something differently. So I'm super curious at the start of your journey with all this, which of the types of wealth did you feel like you were the, I guess, like worst at? I don't love that word, but which ones had most room for growth? And which ones do you feel like you've come the farthest in optimizing?
I really needed to reset and ground myself around my core relationships when we made that change. I mean, I mentioned I was living so far away from my parents, who were some of my best friends in the world. That awareness of just how little time you have left with the people you care about most in the world is a painful yet extraordinary thing to develop an awareness around, because it reminds you of this important fact that there's going to be a last time for everything that you take for granted in life. All of these things that we take for granted today are things that our 80 or 90-year-old self will wish we could go back and do again. And recognizing that now, you can take actions differently. You can live differently. I needed to really pull that to the front of my mind, and I needed to start living differently. I mean, it started with moving 3,000 miles to live closer to both of our sets of parents.
Mm.
That expanded to being in a better place, being really home in a spiritual, metaphorical, energetic, psychological way with my wife. We were living 3,000 miles away. I mentioned we were in this 2-year struggle with infertility. I was clearly not living true to my own values as a human being. I was like chasing all these things that weren't really the things that I should have been or wanting to chase. I was unhealthy in a lot of ways. I was drinking 6, 7 nights a week. We needed to come home. And
Yeah.
within a few weeks of doing that, my wife got pregnant naturally.
Mm.
And you reflect on that, you're like, holy crap. I'm not a particularly religious person, but if there was one point in my life where I felt like God had winked at us,
Hmm.
that was it. It was this moment of you are in the right place, you are doing the right things. And I mean, it's like a movie in my own mind when I look back on it, that May of 2021, I have that conversation with a friend. I'm in as tough of a spot as I've been. A lot of relationships, struggles, health, just not at home. May of 2022, my son is born. We're driving home from the hospital and we pull into our driveway, and both of our sets of parents are standing there cheering, like welcoming us home in a literal and metaphorical sense.
Mm.
And I mean, I can't put into words that feeling and the inspiration that it creates in me to share that idea with the world, to say, that was 1 year. I didn't do anything. There wasn't some dramatic, crazy stroke of genius or, win the lottery, lucky break or something that happened. That was tiny actions done over the course of a year that created this enormous change when you look at these two dates 1 year apart. I mean, that conversation happened May 15th, 2021. My son was born May 16th, 2022.
Mm.
1 year. It is possible to completely transform your life in that if you start focusing on the right things. And if I can get one thing across to people, it is that you have agency over your own life to take action around the things that you really care about, to build a life around the things that you really care about. You do not have to consent to a life by default. You don't have to assimilate or have these mimetic desires around what you should want just based on what other people around you say you should want or what social media tells you should want. You get to decide, and you are empowered to go and do that. And it requires a level of discipline, and it requires a level of independent thinking and a certain sense of disagreeability, that you're just going to say no to some of the environments or some of the pressures. But it is possible.
Yeah. Social media does add an extra layer of just so much information coming at us in all these categories, like how you should spend your time, how your relationships should look, all these different things that you could be learning and growing in. So I definitely think it adds a layer, but I love that you mentioned that it is still possible to have that discipline. And through the book and through so many of the other things you share, I feel like you give such little tangible ways for people to do that, but it's about those consistent actions, like you said, which can be tough, I think, to remind ourselves that it isn't this big one thing. It's these little things that we have to hold ourselves accountable to.
Yeah, and I do think that has gotten more and more difficult in the social media age. And I think that has gotten more difficult across every domain of life, unfortunately. When you think about your desires and the expectations you have for your own life, A lot of your expectations are sort of adopted by default based on your surroundings. That is how humans behave. Historically, pre-social media, that meant your like immediate surroundings dictated a lot of those things. If I lived in New York City, I was going to have kind of like New York City focus points. If I lived in LA, maybe I'd really care more about appearance and fame versus New York, maybe more about money versus wherever. It was sort of a assimilation to those immediate surroundings. Now, your environment can very readily be talked about as also being your digital environment, the algorithm, what it feeds you. And so I might be in a small town where I don't have all those pressures around me, but if my whole algorithm is constantly serving me up things that are telling me that I am not doing enough, or that my life is not enough, that it's not big enough, that it's not glamorous enough, I'm going to feel very bad because my comparison set is this unrealistic set of expectations about what a good life is supposed to look like. It's the same thing for relationships. When you go on social media, your perspective on what a relationship looks like is the falling in love phase over and over and over again, right? It's like the perfect, glamorous, manicured, filtered photos, the honeymoon images, the date nights, the fancy trips, all of those things. That's what you think a relationship looks like. And if that's what you think the standard is, that's your comparison set, well, the fastest way to kill anything good is to compare it to something else. So if that's what you're comparing it to, you're going to completely lose sight of reality, which is that the real joys in life come from doing things slow, come from the growing, right? The tiny daily actions, the showing up for someone, the hard conversations, the doing the hard things now for the benefit later. And that applies to relationships just as much as it applies to your own health, your businesses, anything that you're trying to create in life.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I'm curious, speaking of relationships, that's obviously something I love sharing about. It's the work that I do and focus on. I'm curious when it comes to these five types of wealth. Obviously, a lot of it is in yourself, right? Like you're figuring out how you want to grow and have your purpose. How do you want to spend your time, or how do you want to take care of your physical body? But I'm curious, in a romantic partnership or in your marriage, for example, do you have conversations with your wife where you collectively talk about these five types of wealth and almost you have a shared vision for these things? How much of it's independent and your own, and how much of it do you kind of create together?
Everything is shared for us. I'm a big believer in missions as sort of a framing for life. You get to choose a few missions that you're going on in life, and you get to choose the people that are with you on those missions. And when I am on a mission with someone, we are in it together. And
Hmm.
so, like, I don't think about my work or the work that I do, the writing, the things that I share as me versus her. My wife and son are a huge part of the things that I write and share, right? They're in the book. I talk about a lot of them, and my experiences with them infuse everything that I do. And the reason that I have energy to go and do these things is because I believe it's creating an impact that I want to share with the world, and I want them to be a part of that on this journey. That means that we don't have conversations where it's about, hey, this is me, this is you, and, like totally separate domains. All of it is us. I believe for us, that has really helped with problem solving because rather than things being a me versus you problem, it is an us versus any problem that we are facing as a unit.
Hmm.
That simple reframe as a relationship construct is enormously helpful because whenever we encounter any struggles or challenges, it's us versus the problem rather than me versus her in some
Yeah.
way. And so I really think that as a household, when we decided to get married, that was a that was a commitment, that was a contract, that was a bond. Any religion that you go and look at, right, they view it that way. There's a marriage contract. And on a more spiritual level, I really do believe that. And I
Hmm.
believe it in the same way in her direction. Now, right now, she's in a season of life where she is focusing on being a mom and is the best mom that I can possibly imagine having for my child. And I think if I died tomorrow, he would be extraordinarily fortunate because he would be so loved. I can't imagine a better feeling as a father than knowing that, quite frankly. But it also just means that in that direction, I need to be able to lift her up. She needs to be able to have me along for the mission that she is on, to empower her in the things that she's doing, to make sure that we're both taking care of ourselves in whatever way we need to perform our mission duties well, whatever those are, and really thrive as a family and go and build a life together. I mean, broadly speaking, when you talk about a mission, it's not a siloed mission. It's not like this work mission and this health mission. For me, it's the life we are trying to build What
Yeah.
is it that we are going to try to create over the next, hopefully, 40, 50, 60 years? Who knows? But God will. And that is the bigger picture of how we sort of approach it and the conversations that we have about it.
Yeah. So you're each taking care of your various types of wealth, but for that bigger mission and making sure each of you have the space to be supported. I'm just thinking of like physical wealth, for example. My husband and I aren't always necessarily doing physical wealth together, but when
Correct.
we both
Yeah.
take care of that, it like creates that space, for
Yeah, I
us
would
to
drive
have
her
that.
nuts. I would drive her nuts if I was trying to work out on top of her or whatever. Yeah, no, you definitely need your individual space, but I think each person is sort of responsible for both their own thing, but also empowering the other person to do theirs so
Yes.
that all of us can function on a higher level. The broadest operating idea that I have around relationships is this concept. I talk about it as like the two pillars of strong relationships are
Mm.
high expectations and high support. High expectations are to say, I have very high expectations for what you are capable of. That I believe you are capable of extraordinary things and excellence in everything that you go out and do. High support is to say, I am willing to lift you up on my shoulders to go and meet those high expectations that I have. The two together is very important. High expectations without high support manifests as resentment. We have all felt that at some point in our life, a relationship where the person seemed to have super high expectations for us, but then they were nowhere to be found, disappear. That creates a level of resentment and animosity. High support with no expectations is sort of a recipe for stagnation, mediocrity. You're like, well, the person is there and supporting me, but I don't. There's no bar, right? They don't have a high bar for what they think I'm capable of. Maybe I'm not capable of things. The two together create this extraordinary experience in the bonds that you have. And I think it applies to romantic relationships that I think in both directions we both feel that way, but also to relationship with children, with coworkers, with the people that you're around, being willing to both hold people to a high standard and show up to help them meet those things, be there in the trenches with them is really a beautiful thing.
Yeah, I love that. And you, I think, had mentioned in one of your chapters in the social category this notion of being in the mud with your close relationships. And I've heard Simon Sinek talk about that concept of like being in the mud with someone you love and care about. So, how can you strengthen that ability for that high level of support and make sure that that's a priority in your key relationships while also holding a sense of, I guess, expectation that this person is capable and they're able to pull themselves out of that mud, so to speak.
I think there's a fundamental appreciation for the mud that people need to embrace. This recognition that the mud isn't actually a bad thing. The mud is where amazing things are built and cultivated and grown. I think we can all speak to experiences in our own lives where the most beautiful things in life come on the other side of that mud. And without the mud, we would never have experienced the joy and the beauty on the other side of it. It's one of these dynamic tensions of life, like these things that dance on this razor's edge. My grandmother, before she passed away, said, "Never fear sadness, as it tends to sit right next to love."
Mm,
Same exact idea. The two dance on this razor's edge. You can't have the full appreciation of love without the experience of devastating, terrible sadness. And if you try to get that, you won't get it without the sadness. So if you try to insulate yourself from the mud, you can't experience that full brightness that exists on the other side. What I think that means is that the two of you, whoever it is, whatever relationship, need to have an appreciation for being in that mud together. That like this is when the real strength, when the real growth is created, when the real beauty is created. The ancient poet Rumi said, "The wound is where the light enters you."
mm.
That same idea. The wound is where the light enters you. I always loved that quote because it's a reminder that no matter how bad things are right now, the seeds of your own rebirth and growth are actually being sown during that dark period.
Yeah, I can attest to that with a lower point in my relationship, mostly in my head, like my anxiety about things in a relationship. For very brief context, my parents got a divorce. And so I had a lot of fear around, well, how do you know you're making the right choice in a relationship? So I had a lot of inner stress about just leaning in and being able to give and receive love fully in my very healthy, loving relationship with my now husband. But that low point for me, where I was at the peak of all of my stress and not taking care of myself, really the best, similar to your story, was then the catalyst for me to learn all about this and start sharing and now helping other people in their relationships. So I can definitely attest to that being my experience, similar to your low point that led you to write the book.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, of course. And something you talked about that I resonated a lot with in the book is this notion of high leverage systems. So making sure your systems are really setting you up for success and creating a bigger impact. So I'm curious if you can share examples of some of the high leverage systems that you have in your marriage or as a father that feel like they help you show up in the best way.
Yeah, I mean, this whole idea of high leverage systems is just to say that if you think of life as being about inputs and then outputs, most of us live in this fixed loop where we're sort of at like you put in a unit of input and there's a unit of output. And if you want to create 2 units of output, you have to put in 2 units of input. If you want to create 10, you got to put 10 units of input. That keeps us on this treadmill when you're in that fixed loop. The ideal state is that you can put in 1 unit of input into something and there's 10 units of output. It's asymmetric. It's a small input for a huge output. That is leverage. That is a high leverage system that you're going to do, meaning it's something that doesn't necessarily take a whole ton of energy or effort or time, but it can create a dramatic impact. When I think about that in the world of relationships, there's a couple of things that have really helped. Number one is going through an exercise that I call the relationship map in your own life. You create this map. It's a 2 by 2 matrix. So if you think of the x-axis going across as being about the quality of a relationship, from kind of demeaning on one side to very supportive on the other side. And then on the y-axis, from the bottom to the top, you have the frequency of that relationship, from low frequency interaction to high frequency. What you want to do when you look at that is basically create a visual perspective on the core relationships in your life and where they sit on that map. Create an understanding in your own mind of who are the very supportive and highly frequent people. Those are great. We want to continue to invest in those. Who are the people that are very supportive but less frequent, that maybe I want to lean into those more because these people are really lifting me up, encouraging me to think bigger? Who are the people that are way too frequent and very demeaning, like those sort of toxic relationships in our life that I need to lean away from? And then, arguably, the most impactful, who are these people that are sort of hot and cold? The sometimes demeaning, sometimes supportive people, ambivalent
Mm,
relationships, if you will. Scientifically, ambivalent relationships are the worst for your health because those are the people that you let in when they're supportive and loving, and then they're the one that stab you when they're in.
mhm,
And they've run studies where you put someone up in front of a crowd of people and you either have them be like booing a whole ton or you have them cheering a whole ton, and then you have a crowd that's sort of mixed. And the mixed crowd generates the highest sort of stress and blood pressure response from the person speaking. It's the most uneasy in your life. You kind of know that when it comes to relationships. But identifying who those people are to have a clear perspective on it so that you can create systems to avoid or to lean into these people is a really helpful starting point when you think about improving your relationship, your social wealth profile. Romantic relationships, when it comes to those from a system standpoint, the single best system that has helped us in our relationship is a very simple one, which is called the helped, heard, or hugged method.
mhm,
Basically, when someone comes to you with a problem, you ask, do you want to be helped, heard, or hugged? Helped is advice given, heard is just listen, let the person vent, and hugged is just listen and then provide comforting touch. That is so impactful for a lot of people. I would say men especially, because we tend to be fixers. Like our bias is to fix. And so what would happen in my relationship with my wife is she would come home with some sort of problem. I would go into fixer mode and I'd be listening, analyzing, trying to fix the problem. I would try to offer a solution. And then I'd be so confused as to why it didn't resonate or why she got annoyed at me or frustrated. And what I came to realize after internalizing this idea of helped, heard, or hugged is that I was showing up in the way that made sense to me, not the way
mhm,
she needed me to show up in the moment. And when you're talking about a relationship, again, to the point of us versus problem, she needs me to show up in the way that's helpful for her in that moment, not the way that's natural to me. And so learning to ask that question to develop a pattern for how does this person want me to show up in these situations unbelievably impactful in terms of your ability to navigate those little and larger daily challenges that you might come into.
Yeah, I love that. And I've found that sometimes it's helpful on my end if I'm communicating to my husband and I know he has the tendency to jump in and help versus hearing what I have to say, that I can sometimes set that tone by saying, I just want to be heard right now. So it can kind of go both directions if you have something you're looking for from the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the broadest point on that is communication. Everyone knows like communication is very key in a relationship. One thing that we have found, particularly in the time period since our son was born, he was born 3 years ago, is that in relationships, scientifically, 80% of married couples say that their relationship got worse in the year after their child was born. Crazy statistic. 4/5 of married couples say their relationship got worse. Biggest driver of that is that all of a sudden you go from being in a relationship where you are each other's most important person to suddenly there's this new thing, being, who is both of your most important thing. And what happens is a lot of people lose sight of this connection between the two of them, and you just focus on this one to the child. And when that happens, you start losing appreciation for one another. You stop vocalizing appreciation. There stops being that connection of what you two need. That mission sort of gets clouded. The remedy or the antidote to that has been for us what we call this idea of a life dinner.
Mm.
Once a month, we make sure that we're carving out a date to sit down and talk about that bigger picture mission, both of our own goals and priorities and things that we're excited or nervous about, and then also together what it is that we're going and trying to create. What are we working on? What are we, looking to do in the months ahead? That has been a fun and also extremely positive, impactful ritual in our relationship to just make sure that we get the time for us that sits alongside all of the chaos that comes in those early months and years of having a young kid in the house.
Yeah, I really liked that idea from the book, and I shared it with my husband, who is not currently in town this week. But I was like, let's start this once you're back because I feel like it's something we could use. And I love that you gave kind of that monthly and then maybe more of an on the spot type thing at the start of the week. Is there any like, hey, how can we best support each other in our mission this week? Or do you feel like the monthly check-in is enough for some of that?
We do a quick calendar based check in at the start of a week. So Sunday night, I always do like a 15-minute, what does my week look like? If there's travel or different, talks or appearances, things that I have to go and do professionally. And I use that as a conduit for a conversation to just say, like, what does our week look like on our calendar? Where are we all heading? What are we doing? What's happening with Roman and activities or school stuff? Or are we traveling? Are you traveling? Like all of those things that set the tone from a coordination standpoint that everything then sort of flows off of. The biggest reason for doing that, candidly, is one of my core priorities is making sure we get enough unstructured family time together. I
Hmm.
just want to be able to like go in the pool at 1 p.m. on a Tuesday. That's sort of my version of a wealthy life is being able to do that. I feel very blessed to have created a life where I do have the freedom and financial means to go and do that. And I want to make sure that I actually embrace it and appreciate it and experience it. And that comes from having a level of understanding of where all the moving parts are in our lives. And when we're running afoul of that, when things have skewed towards too busy, making sure we pull back to reset. Even yesterday, this week, I'm at home and my wife is with our son and a couple other family members at the Jersey Shore at this beach house. And my wife was saying, I think you've been a little too bit, you've been running a little too hard on things. Like, let's make sure once you get through this push, which is another sort of 2 months, let's make sure we take a full week where you're just not working and we all just are together. And the ability to say that on the fly, for me to hear it, internalize it, recognize it, and then for us to make an adjustment as a result, I don't think about it in the moment, but reflecting on it now and speaking to you, it's a really impactful thing for making sure that we're on course for what we're actually going and trying to create.
Yeah, I love it. It sounds like you have some regular systems and then some of it is also just flexible, but having that shared understanding of the bigger why is kind of what takes you back to that and grounds you.
Exactly.
I love that. Okay, well, I want to be mindful to stay on track here with timing, but I guess if you have any final thoughts, something you brought up earlier about this notion of falling in love being easy and growing in love is actually more challenging, and then this notion of comparison and the quest for more taking us away from, I think you phrased it as the beauty of enough. How can we be more intentional about that, especially with our romantic relationships. Because, as you kind of said earlier, there's always going to be someone saying that they're doing more, or they have this better thing, or here's what you should be doing, or I have this new shiny relationship. How can we really ground into the beauty of enough in our romantic relationships and in our greater life?
Yeah, I think the misconception with the word enough is that it means the end of ambition. When you say enough, most people say, like, okay, well, then you get it, and then there's nothing more. It's like the end of ambition or the end of growth. And that is really not the case in the way that I think about enough. I think about enough as being all about the fact that your expectations are your single greatest liability in life. If you allow your expectations to accelerate faster than your reality, you will never feel contentment. You will never feel happiness. You will never feel that feeling of fulfillment. And so understanding that your expectations are sort of a byproduct of the things that are around you and your consumption and your willingness to keep them in check is really essential to managing your own journey, your own path on all of this. There is nothing wrong with continuing to chase ambition, with continuing to push for growth in your relationships, in your life, to continue to try to create more. But it has to be grounded in the right reasons. I might want to create more love and depth and connection with my wife and with my son, but it's not going to be about creating more money. Like when I talk about enough, I talk about the life that we are trying to all go and build, the impact we're trying to create, the purpose that we're trying to pursue. Part of enough for us is continuing to hopefully scale those things. Like, I want to grow in love with my wife until we die. I want to continue to feel like we are getting closer, deepening a bond, growing in love in that way. It's the same way I feel about my son and my relationship. I want to continue to grow and adapt and change and recognize that that's part of that journey. And that enough is much more of a dynamic concept as long as it's grounded in the right things and in the more meaningful things in life beyond just the money.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say is that you can still, of course, keep growing and pushing for more in a deeper way, but as long as it's rooted in what's true for you versus what someone told you you should want.
Exactly. It just can't be about someone else's map of reality impacting how you feel about your terrain. And that is what we do when we look externally. We look for other people's answers to our journey. And when you do that, you're setting yourself up for disaster. And you, again, the best way to kill something good is to compare it to something else. And when you constantly are looking around you, you forget to turn inward and recognize the beauty of the things that you have, right? You're chasing all of these other things out there in the world and losing sight of the fact that you are living out the good old days right now in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who has clearly figured out a lot of things in the last 5 years about all these categories of wealth, how you spend your time, who you spend it with, taking care of your mind and body, and finances as well, what is something that you still struggle with or a challenge for you that maybe someone from the outside looking in might never see?
I struggle with knowing when to slow down. I mentioned that example of my wife sending that message to me. When I get excited about things, my bias is to go like full psycho mode, all in on those things. Yeah, I've been that way. I was an athlete growing up. I got a scholarship to play baseball in college. I've always been hardwired to when I get excited about something, I go all in on it. And that is a really positive trait in certain contexts. And in others, it can really lead you astray. It can drive you into this unbalance that is an unforced error. It is an unnecessary unforced error. And I'd say in particular in the aftermath of the book coming out, the success that the book has had in reaching people, a lot of opportunities come up as a result of that. And the opportunities are exciting and the opportunities are driven by the right things, meaning it's like it's impact and it's the things that I do care about. And so it's very easy for me to lean into them, take on everything, and then blink and realize that I missed a whole summer with my son, or that I traveled, 150 nights out of the year, or that I wasn't there for the things that I committed to, that I wrote about in the book that I was going to be there for. So I would just say that has been a bit of a struggle. And I'm fortunate that I have a wife who is a grounding force around that, who we have a lot of alignment together around that. And she knows that that's the risk that I run. So she knows when to call me on it and when we need to reset.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. definitely can relate to just the thing, especially you said about what you write about, and then sometimes you still have a hard time practicing it. I can have that in certain areas in my work as well.
I mean, the funniest one was I really cared when the book came out about it hitting the New York Times bestseller list. And the opening chapter of the book, I talk about the arrival fallacy, like this idea that you build up these things as being the point where you'll feel fundamentally different about yourself. You go get this gold medal or go get this thing, and you're going to feel different. Your whole life is going to be different. And I was talking about it as a negative in our lives. And then I'm sitting there being like, but I really want to make the New York Times list, right? Like you're falling victim to the exact thing that you're telling people that you shouldn't fall victim to. So it was a very funny irony of the whole journey.
Yeah, just a human moment, I like to call them.
Very, very, very human moment. I think that's an important point, though. There's no such thing as figuring it out on any of these fronts.
Yeah.
Everyone is in this ongoing, recurring process of stumbling and hopefully stumbling a little bit better every day than the prior. But if you're not looking foolish at some point, I just feel like you're not taking enough chances. You're not pushing yourself a little bit hard enough.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, before you share where people can stay connected with you, because this is the You Love and You Learn podcast, what is something you've learned about love that you would want to leave listeners with?
I would just say that all of the greatest things in life are found through our relationships. It is impossible to enjoy any of life's most meaningful experiences without people by your side. Relationships are what made us human, what allowed us to survive and thrive. And so, if you ever lose sight of that, if you're ever prioritizing your career and all of these other things in your life, but completely forgetting those people and those relationships, you are very much studying for the wrong test. And so, invest in your relationships in the way that you know to invest in money. Investments in relationships are the single best investment that you can make. They compound just as effectively as any investment. And scientifically, we know relationships are the thing that are going to lead to you aging well and growing in that way that you want to grow. So I would just leave people with that.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for the wisdom you've shared today. Where can people stay connected with you?
You can find the book, The Five Types of Wealth, on Amazon or anywhere else books are sold. And you can find me at Sahil Bloom on any of the major platforms. And you can find my newsletter at my website, sahilbloom.com.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It was a great conversation. I appreciate your time. I know you have a lot going on with the success of the book, so thank you so much for spending it with us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course.